Gautama is the founder of the Nyaya school, and he's the author of the Nyaya Sutra. It is the greatest manual on debate in India, like the text collected into Aristotle's Organon. Gautama is also known as Akshapada, eyes in the feet, or gazes at the feet, gathering particular cows into the group of all horned animals, which includes all cows and types of cows, which is the sort of Aristotelian zoology these folks were doing in order to understand logic and how to argue about the world with concrete examples. And they believe you can surround yourself with real examples of real cows, and that mostly your senses and your mind do not lie to you. The Sharvakas would say every time your mind tells you there's a group of universal cows, your mind is overgeneralizing. Nyaya would say no, most of what your eyes, most of what your ears, and most of what your reason tells you all day long is not lies and is perfectly justifiable, and thus they are the Nyaya, the justified, justifiable school, which is like logic. The word logic technically means something speaky, something right speech, so we can build on empirical reality, on witnessing things with the eyes and the ears, the group of general all cows having horns. The Nyaya school reached its height in 150 CE. The other famed Nyaya logicians each wrote commentaries on the Nyaya Sutra of Gautama. This is how logicians and others are famous. They write commentaries on commentaries on commentaries in the Aristotelian Abrahamic world. So the Nyaya Sutra presents many debates that raged at the time, with many centered on dividing the mortal in particular from the eternal and universal, such as whether or not the self, world, or laws of the cosmos are permanent or fixed in this or that way, if we only see changing things. What is the underlying similarity or structure, and are there any absolute structures if things are all in motion? One of these questions, they debate whether or not sound is temporary. What is the sound of one hand clapping, and is the self permanent with Buddhism? And Kanada, like a Buddhist, says that it is temporary. Sound is mortal, unlike the soul and self according to the Hindus. For the Hindus, you do have a permanent self, an Atman. For the Buddhists and Jains, you do not have a permanent self, an Atman. Is your self like sound, and what signs of the self and sound can we empirically deduce to know that self is or isn't like sound? You should understand these ideas before you take on Zen. The primary source of knowledge is perception for the Nyaya, which makes them very much empiricists, which makes them very similar to modern science. In the ancient world, people had to observe lightning and clouds, and they did not have as much equipment to experiment. Inference is when you draw a connection. That cow has horns, that cow has horns, that cow has horns. They also have the third, comparison, some translate as analogy, and testimony, the final of the four. Witness is what you get in a court of law. There are four sources, pramana, of knowledge for the Nyaya, but the latter three are secondary and inferior to the first, which is perception, direct experience, concrete examples of what we infer, compare, or hear about through testimony of others. So inferences can be hastily drawn, but if they are drawn slowly, based in good, careful reason, we should entertain them positively and favorably, not as certain, but as openly possible. The same is true of perception, comparison, and testimony, such that they are overall reliable if we are careful with them. The Nyaya Sutra and commentaries tell us that there are problems we have with the four sources of knowledge, such that we can misperceive and see what isn't there, or not see what is there, even though perception is their primary source, that supports all others insofar as the others are justified. Vatsyayana argues that we can see what we think is smoke and infer there is fire, or hear that there is a fire by testimony, or make comparisons for ourselves from afar. Notice the use of all of these. But it is perception, seeing the fire, that is best, and that best confirms comparisons, testimony, and inferences. Giving a negative example, he similarly argues that seeing a mirage and hoping for water, it is only when we see what isn't there, the water's absence, that our inference is disproved. This is a quote from the text. With knowledge, perception is best. When we learn something from trustworthy testimony, we may still want to know it another way, such as by inference. Understanding by inference, we may still want to know it through experience, but seeing it, the desire to know ceases. The sutra says that certainty is grasping something by thinking about possibilities, investigating thesis and counter-thesis, and that the sources can be objects of knowledge themselves, like a measuring scale. The sutra says that opponents argue that objects are like dreams, mirages, or magic cities in the sky, not fixed as real, and says that they haven't provided a reason to accept this. The Nyaya would say perception is primary and more certain than comparison, which is how we live, and then they will lean more towards the positive. The Nyaya Sutra says that words are used to refer in three ways: to individuals, forms, and classes, and these multiple ways produce doubt, which sparks inquiry. Vatsyayana provides us with the example of cow, and says the word refers to an individual cow, which it does. Anything shaped like a cow, which is the metaphor, and that is like a cow, but not. So anything that's cow-like, which means a statue of a cow is a cow, because it is very cow-like, but it is a cow-like and a cow in a different different way than something that is a specific cow. But of course, there's a third word, which is cows. Cows means the group of all cows. So all of them, all together, is cow. That's 3 uses of the word, and you'll notice they're all very much as we use English, French, anything. The sutra refutes those who think words refer to only one of these things, and they argue this is where these confusions come from. But as Vatsyayana adds, if somebody says to wash, bring, or donate a cow and we hand them a cow statue, we are wrong and do not satisfy their request, as it lacks the category of being alive or an animal, so it's wrong sort of cow. Debate manuals like the Nyaya Sutra of Gautama, the Organon of Aristotle, and works by Mois in China and others were designed to introduce students and scholars to forms of argument, methods of attack and defense. Like Aristotle, Vatsyayana argues that debate proceeds from motives, and so a destructive skeptic debates destructively, without a committed motive or accepted doctrine. Aristotle says, if Socrates is a man and if all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal. Here's Gautama. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire, as in a kitchen. So because there is smoke on the hill, there is fire on the hill. Quite identical to Socrates as a man is mortal. That's the positive proof. The second example is a negative proof, and this one has to do with sound. Sound is made. Whatever is made is impermanent, like a pot. So, sound, which includes words, is impermanent. That which is made with human hands. Yes, a la 2 of them for the Buddhists. So the Nyaya Sutra also lists fallacies, like you find with Aristotle in Sophistical Refutations, and you find very much celebrated in the work of Lewis Carroll. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland is a recipe of fallacies, as well as I argue Aristotelian forms. And it says we can see a post in the dark and mistake it for a man. I use this example all the time. Your eyes can lie to you. The sutra warns us, much like Aristotle, that debate is about winning, but you want to be right. You can make clinchers, the translators translate this as cheap shots, or you can quibble, as it is translated, nitpick, but you could lose the debate. For fallacies, the sutra includes silence, you just sit there. Say nothing. Changing the thesis, but you're arguing something different than we were before. Evasion, it says in translation, I am called by nature. I need to go behind this tree over here for a while. I can't debate you about whether or not the self is permanent because I'm in an impermanent and partial position at the moment. Another of the fallacies is meaningless or incoherent speech. He is speaking the language of gods. No, technically he doesn't know what to say right here. Chomsky gave the example, colorless sleep furiously green, which he thinks is meaningless. Overlooking the fallacies in another's argument, repetition, simply repeating, this is great, I argue this is great. Well, that's repetition. That's not good enough. My personal favorite, sharing the fault. Pointing out a fault that is in an opponent that is also a fault in your own argument. My opponent is putting forward a mere mortal point of view. The sutra gives 3 types of quibbling, bringing up problems that don't turn out to be problems, which correspond to the 3 uses of words, things, form, and class. Vatsyayana gives us examples of each, as he does with his commentary for everything in the sutra. For quibbling over words used for things, he says someone could say that they have a new, nava, blanket, and somebody else could misunderstand, notice there aren't plurals here like with Chinese, and think that they claim they had 9 blankets, because if I say nava blanket, I say 9 blanket. For quibbling over form, someone could say the stands cry out, but if somebody says, well, stands can't cry out, they're made of metal and wood, you jerk, you're like, I was using a metaphor, thanks. For quibbling over class, someone could say all Brahmins are educated, and someone says not all Brahmins are educated because some are only 3 years old and just learning to talk. Well, obviously your word did not mean them. If I say horses, I would often mean a 4-legged horse. And if you brought me a 3-legged horse, I'd be like, that's not good enough for me. Now, did you do what I asked you or not if you bring me a 3-legged horse? Let's say you bring me a horse that's almost dead, and I say I want a horse to plow a field. You didn't do it right, but you brought me a horse, right?